Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us. Good afternoon and happy Monday. This is a Globe Talk in honor of World Mental Health Day, and it is titled Isolation and Connection During the Global Pandemic, an Existential and Terror Management Theoretical Perspective. The session is brought to you by TCS Global Engagement. TCS education system and all of our schools are committed to preparing innovative and engaged purposeful agents of change who better serve our global community. We work to bring this mission to life by providing leadership, infrastructure, and support for internationalization throughout the TCS community. And we're really passionate about creating learning opportunities that have a positive impact on our global community. Our Globe Talk series is part of this mission, and we provide virtual year-round discussions in order to introduce our community to thought leaders in higher ed, experts on key functional areas, best practices, and the diversity of thought necessary to expand our own internal strategic thinking. Before we begin today's session, and this happened already before the session began, where internet connections give us some issues sometimes. So we please ask you to be patient with us, and if there are any issues with connection, we recommend that you turn off your camera in order to conserve bandwidth. Please also keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, but feel free to use the chat box throughout the session. We do have a time for Q&A at the end of the session. However, we will be monitoring the chat box throughout. Now, before I begin, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today. Dr. Drake Spaeth is the Existential Humanistic Psychology Specialization Coordinator for the Humanistic Clinical Psychology Department at Saybrook. He is also the alum of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He currently serves as an associate adjunct professor and was core faculty for 13 years. He was also recognized as a distinguished alumnus of TCSPP for 2020, and he is an affiliate faculty at Northwestern University. Now, without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Spaeth to introduce himself a little more and begin this conversation.
All right. Let me see here. Am I sharing the screen already?
Not yet.
Okay. Pardon a few technical challenges here. Bear with me. All right, hopefully that should do it. Everybody see that? Great. All right, good. Thank you. So yes, so some of this you heard already. So thank you very much, Nancy. I wanted to just add that in addition to some of those things, I do have a part-time private practice at this point. I shifted into teaching and some other administrative work a few years ago, but for a long time, I had a largely clinical career. Now I have a small private practice where I focus on psychospiritual challenges of clients, their trauma issues, and issues and challenges around personal and professional development. I was past president of APA Division 32 for the year 2019 to 2020, right as the pandemic really kind of got underway. And that is also known as the Society for Humanistic Psychology. I live in Waukesha, Wisconsin, about 100 miles or so north of Chicago, with my wife, Angie, and our Lhasa Apso Puka, who you may actually hear raising some objections to various things I say from upstairs here and there. So I hope you will pardon his input here and there. All right. So I really want to kind of focus on the global pandemic and how it has really illuminated what happens when unprecedented numbers of people face their mortality and terror of the unknown. I mean, in our lifetimes, certainly in my lifetime, and I'm probably older than many of you here, I don't believe that we have faced something of this scale. So never before has existential humanistic psychology and the terror management theory perspective that I'm going to discuss here, never has it been more relevant, in my opinion. So I think that this is really important for mental health professionals and those interested in mental health issues and challenges to really kind of understand and see this in perspective. So again, in large numbers, we've been grappling with these questions of meaning and purpose, the value of human life, inequalities and access to healthcare really across the globe, and enforced isolation. Our longing for intimacy, authenticity, and human connection in the face of this separation and global violence has engendered large-scale mental health challenges for a lot of us. And this includes, by the way, many mental health professionals. And frankly, our self-care and our ability to address that has been lagging. I think that there's a real mental health crisis across the globe because of this. And I think there's an invitation here really to kind of consider how we'll engage in more effective self-care and how we'll reconnect with those things that feed and nurture our souls and our spirit. And yes, I am that kind of psychologist and mental health professional who does not shy away from talking about the soul. In fact, I speak of it with pride. This is psyche logos, after all. Psyche, the Greek word for spirit and soul. Logos, the science or language or knowledge. So we're supposed to be speaking the language of the soul, even in the etymology of our field. So those are the things that really are important to me and that I think are really kind of coming to the forefront with all of this. So I think it does afford us opportunities for creativity and resourcefulness. And I've built into a place in this presentation a space where we can talk about that a little bit. So these approaches, existential psychological approaches, terror management theory, they really, to me, seem to illuminate what is happening in unique ways. And I maintain that through our endurance of all of this, and sometimes it seems to go on interminably, and sometimes there's even, for me, a disconnection from time and place with all of that, kind of a dissociative, almost disembodiedness to all of it. That endurance, nevertheless, I have this belief that our longing for connection and our bridging of isolation may yet prevail in helpful ways. At least I hope so. It's interesting to me, kind of setting the context of this, that even in 2019, dictionary.com elevated existential as their word of the year, almost as if, we could sense what was coming in some ways. And I think that they did so because it was a word being used in the news a lot, even then, that there are existential threats to democracy or, existential challenges. And it was starting to be thrown around by pundits, but it's timely nevertheless. And I think that it really helped bring awareness of this word into people's consciousness at a larger scale than we had seen prior to that. All right, so what I would like to try to cover today are some existential humanistic views in terms of their relevance to this issue. So I'm not going to go necessarily in depth into existential philosophy or even deep into existential psychology and psychotherapy, but I do want to mention sort of the core and key concepts that I see as really relevant to this. Hopefully that will flow nicely into talking about terror management theory, which I see as a psychodynamic perspective because it speaks of unconscious. The existential humanistic perspectives don't really have a concept of unconscious and conscious per se. We like to talk in humanistic terms, especially about things being out of awareness and coming into awareness. And that's about as close as we get. terror management theory really brings in this concept of the unconscious in a big way. But there are deep existential themes in terror management theory, and it has a really nice way of focusing the discussion that we're having on accurately reflecting, I believe, what's going on in the world right now. I really want to also hone in on proximal and distal defenses, key concepts of terror management theory, and how they apply to all of this. I'll very briefly consider Ernest Becker's denial of death approach in terms of its connection to terror management theory and also some of these existential ideas. Then I want to open it up to some multicultural and diversity considerations that I think are very important to consider in connection with all of this. And then kind of concluding with the discussion of invitations and opportunities for our creativity and resourcefulness as mental health professionals, or those who care deeply about mental health and all of this. And then presumably, if we get through all of that in a timely way, there'll be ample opportunity for questions and discussions in the best of all worlds. So, all right, so without further ado, one of my favorite pieces of existential humanistic psychology to talk about is this paradox, this seeming contradiction between isolation and connection as concepts. A lot of the existential philosophers and the subsequent existential psychologists speak of the fact that in our human experience, we at deep fundamental levels have to confront an awareness that we are ultimately alone. In other words, in our self-awareness, we know that no one else shares these bodies that we're sort of taking through these lives. No one knows what it's like to be us specifically. We experience the world and relationships with others through this lens sort of self-awareness. And if we allow ourselves to dwell on that, there can be a sort of stomach dropping sensation, if you will, in the realization that we are isolated, that no one shares our consciousness with us in our embodiedness in our life and in our embeddedness, even in our social situations. And when we come to the end of our lives, we ultimately die alone. People can be holding our hands, we could be surrounded by our loved ones, and hopefully that will be the case, and that's comforting. But we cross that mystery threshold alone at the end of the day. And yet, in another weird sense, we're not alone in that isolation. All of us experience that. We can take some comfort and perhaps a sense of connection and connectedness in the fact that we are isolated and alone. So it's a way of kind of holding the contradiction, if you will. And if we allow briefly for a moment, if we can briefly consider transpersonal psychology, in transpersonal psychology perspectives, in fact, there's this idea that maybe what we believe to be humanness and the state of being human beings is too limited and restricted. And in fact, maybe our restrictive categories of separation are artificial human constructions, if you will, that we are made of the same stuff as the universe, as the planet of, plants and animals and minerals. And maybe consciousness is not necessarily relegated to a human experience, even if we don't understand the consciousness and even sentience of other beings. It doesn't mean that those things don't exist, but we are a part of all of that, and we are fundamentally interconnected. So perhaps if we can briefly allow in that transpersonal psychology piece, we can take some comfort in the fact that we are not alone And that could be the other side of the paradox that we could hold. But nevertheless, there is this tension, right, between one and the other. And I think that's a nice entry point for talking about Karen Horney's work. Horney really spoke of the fear of being alone and helpless in a potentially hostile world as leading to this need for affection, partnership, structure, power, control, prestige, admiration, achievement, independence, and perfection. These are the things that kind of give us comfort. The fact that we can sort of impose a sense of order and meaning and structure on everything that seems chaotic and helpless. So many things in life are out of our control that we can take some comfort about having some sense of control over it, some sense of being a part of it all, some sense in being in partnership with each other, with other kinds of forces. If we can have some achievement in our lives, and if our achievement motivation can lead to some sense of success, which results in admiration from other people. If we experience independently moving through our world with confidence and achieving, striving for perfection, this can give us a sense that we're doing something that means something. And this really hints at the type of immortality that I'm going to talk about a lot more in this presentation. So I think Karen Horney really lays a good foundation here ultimately for some of the themes that we're going to talk about. And then where would we be if good old Unky Carl Rogers doesn't come into the discussion in some way, shape, or fashion? Carl Rogers, in his individual therapy work, really emphasized how human beings have a longing to move out of their sense of being limited in their experience of themselves in the world, to move out of this experience of fragmentation and separation, and only being able to live as tiny pieces of ourselves at any given time toward a state of wholeness, toward greater authenticity. We long for wholeness like a plant longs for the sunlight and will move and grow in a way to reach the sun and to make sure that its photosynthesis can happen. He saw our longing for wholeness in a similar kind of fashion. I believe that collectively, we also experience such longing for authentic connection and relationships with each other. And this particularly becomes constellated during times when those things are threatened. And certainly the current conditions of the pandemic and many of the other challenges we're facing in global perspective, the things that fragment us, the things that polarize us, the things that drive us apart, really also crystallize this longing to kind of come together. I mentioned Gestalt therapy perspectives here too, because in Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls and others talked about the fact that we constantly move between these poles of isolation and connection. We want and crave contact with others in authentic ways. We crave intimacy. We crave to be seen, heard, recognized, and we move toward those things. And then our fears kind of come into play. Our sense of vulnerability comes to the surface, and it feels uncomfortable to be seen and heard to that extent. So we will do things to build walls of separation again so that it can be a little more manageable. And then sometimes we go overboard and become much more isolated, in which case the loneliness piece of all of that starts to make itself felt again. So we start doing things to try to tear down those walls in what might be considered to be both constructive and maybe less constructive kinds of ways. And it sort of moves in and out. It's almost like breathing, right? We move in, we move out, we come closer, we move apart. It's like a heartbeat or breathing. This expansion and contraction idea is so important because it mirrors cyclically what we see happening in the natural world. During times of extreme crisis, we're going to see collective manifestations of extreme isolation and strange manifestations of our longing for connection and coming together. And also, making sure that we have some way of facing our fears of isolation, particularly when death is at stake and is the issue that's presenting itself. I really think we would be remiss if I didn't at least mention Rollo May in this context. Rollo May is very important to Saybrook's history and founding. But Rollo talks about death anxiety as being ultimately the core source, really, of most of the anxieties we experience in life. If you trace back everything that you're worried about or anxious about, and you do it long enough and you engage in it persistently enough, you will ultimately find yourself at this place where death is the ultimate kind of fear that we have. Leaving this world, not knowing what comes after, and having our lives mean something, or being afraid that it doesn't mean something. So it might either engender avoidant behaviors for a period of time, hopefully not indefinitely, but tragically for some, possibly, where we engage in banal kinds of distractions from the fact that we are living our lives and one day we will not be, and there may be no sign that we were ever here, and who will remember us, who will know that we were here, and that what we've done matters in some way. But more to the point, it is the biggest and deepest motivation we have toward creativity and doing something with our lives in creative ways to show that we were here and to hopefully leave the world a little bit better. That our lives not only mattered, but maybe the world is actually a little bit better for us having lived those lives, that we have contributed in some meaningful kind of way. So this is very serious level anxiety. Irvin Yalom adds to that, I'm sort of being humorous here. This is my phrase, not Yalom's phrase, that death is actually the ultimate FOMO, the ultimate fear of missing out. The way Yalom talks about it is we all think it's about a fear of death, but the deeper truth is that it's a fear of never having truly lived. So that, what happens is that we want to not have these regrets at the end of our lives, but paradoxically, the very fear of those things can also immobilize us. And so in that immobility, and in that sort of panic state, we long for somebody to rescue us, Yalom says, and he talks a lot about the quote unquote ultimate rescuer in his work. And he's also said that in this respect, death anxiety is the mother of religion. And in that statement, in connection with that statement, I can't help but think about how etymologically the word religion, re ligio, literally means to tie back. It's the same root word as ligature, L-I-G. So ligament, ligature, some kind of tie, connection. We long for a tying back, a returning, a binding back to the source in some way. So we want to be rescued from, we want to be liberated from our mortality and the ultimate idea that one day we will no longer be, with some sense of some immortality or something that can sort of liberate us from all of that. And again, this leads to both helpful and sometimes less helpful kinds of consequences. I would just say that with the reminders of the imminent possibility of death being so close in so many ways for such a long period of time, that all of these things are coming to the surface in ways that I have never experienced in my lifetime. And I see it all around me in those that I love and those that I work with, and of course in myself. So Yalom also talks about the givens of existence, and Harry and Bugenthal add to this list one called Embodiedness. So this makes the givens death, freedom and responsibility, isolation, meaninglessness, and embodiedness. So we've talked a lot about death and death anxiety already, but one of the deepest kinds of concerns that we confront in the course of our lives that can be a source of anxiety is also this idea of freedom and responsibility. The constant fear, what if I choose the wrong thing? I have so many different paths I can take. I have so many different things I can do with my life in so many different ways. And there are so many people who potentially need me or could benefit from something that I have to offer. What is the best possible avenue that I can take? And what if I take the wrong avenue? And what if I make the wrong choice? So what to do with our freedom and the responsibility that sort of is attendant to all of that. And we talked a little bit already about confronting isolation in our lives and the loneliness, the experience and feelings of loneliness that ultimately produces and leads to. Meaninglessness, the possibility that there is no inherent meaning. And what does that mean for me? What am I here for in this ridiculously short time that I have? What's it all about? And if it's about nothing, what is the point? So the temptation to sort of resort to nihilism and, the sense of meaninglessness could lead to a sense of despair as a possibility. Or we could look at it and say, we make meaning because that's what we are as human beings. We are meaning makers par excellence. And then Harry and Bugenthal talk about embodiedness, the fact that we are in these physical bodies and we're very limited by what we can do in them and that they wear out over a period of time. And we cannot experience the fullness of the world and the universe through these bodies. In fact, we experience it in very limited ways through our physical senses, which at the end of the day are really the result of brain processing of input that comes in, and our brain receptors translate it into something that allows us to experience the world in an orderly way. One might say that we're swimming in a sea of brain processing. I hate to reduce it to that, but I think that's the point of being human, is we take that piece of it and we create something wonderful about the way we're living these lives in our world through all of it. Viktor Frankl, in his wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl himself, who was in the concentration camps and really experiencing this confrontation with meaninglessness. This was a validation for him of work he was already doing around how we long and work toward a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And Frankl was different than many other existential psychologists in that he really believed there is meaning to be discovered for each of us, that we are all here to do something unique in the world, that we have that potential, every single one of us who are born. And the outcome that so few ultimately get to achieve that meaning is a tragic thing. And we all need to work to make sure that that is something that's possible for more of us. But we need, in doing so, to confront what he calls the existential vacuum, which I think you could also refer to as meaninglessness in other contexts. This fear that, again, what is there if I go deep enough and really take a look at what's inside myself and what I am here for and what my purpose is. And Frankl pointed out that, his whole approach, which he called logotherapy, ought to be added to what he saw going on with psychodynamic therapy work and cognitive behavioral therapy work as it was beginning to grow and emerge, because he felt that CBT in particular didn't get deep enough, that you could talk about automatic thoughts and a sense of worthlessness and a sense of being isolated and lonely and all of those things and the thoughts and the beliefs that lead to those feelings. But it doesn't get at this existential vacuum, which gives rise to that belief in the first place. So again, kind of really getting at the core of all of these things. So I've added this little piece called brain fog because I had to confront this for several months in my own recovery from a very, very mild bout of COVID-19. But I had long COVID for months and this horrible brain fog for a period of 4 months. And we're seeing a lot of reports of this kind of come out, the sense of confusion, a feeling of being displaced in time, an inability to concentrate. The short-term memory really kind of becomes fragmented and impaired, and there's a lot of mental confusion. I can't help but wonder if the sheer amount of these sort of existential threats hasn't been overwhelming to some of us, and that, is the brain fog in some ways a response to this confrontation of the vacuum, this confrontation with death anxiety, this sense of confusion or displacement in time and space. Is there an existential piece of this worth exploring? I think we haven't really even gotten past the surface of that, but it's something that I've begun to really wonder about. And I thought it was relevant here, so I thought I would bring it up. And then I did a presentation at some Saybrook events about conspiracy theories, and I think this will really make sense too in connection with some of the terror management material I'm about to get into. But we see how popular conspiracy theories are, how dangerous they are, and how all-encompassing they are. And, I invite you here to think about this in connection with some of the things that I've talked about here on this slide already, going back even to Horney's work and the need for power, control, a sense of structure, a sense of place in all of the chaos. I think that conspiracy theories are so compelling to some because it's the only thing that they can latch onto that will give them a sense of understanding of something that they feel goes deeper than the surface. And I think the sort of comfort we get at understanding the hidden meaning of something, the inner workings of something, the idea of being in on the so-called truth, whatever that is, it can be a comfort in the face of the chaos, the confusion, the sense of being out of control, and the sense that death could take us unexpectedly at any point. It gives a sense of order to things. So I think I see it as an unrequited longing for meaning and purpose, ultimately. And I think about it a little bit even transpersonally, that, it's a poetic way of saying it, an unrequited existential longing for the transpersonal. But I think that there's a lot of truth and meaning in poetry and some insight with all of it. So I think that one of the things we can really best do for our clients who are prone to this conspiracy theory kind of thinking is to collaborate with them on ways of fulfilling this longing in more helpful and meaningful kinds of ways. All right. Moving into the terror management piece of all of this a little bit. I love this because I really think it gives some focus to some of the general things that we've been talking about. So this was a theory proposed by Greenberg and Pachynski and colleagues all the way back in 1986. And it really, in my opinion, fits well under the psychodynamic umbrella and some of the relational psychodynamic theories, but it embodies a lot of existential themes. So for TMT, death awareness is unconsciously at the root of behaviors such as we see connected to the pandemic. Regardless of what our conscious beliefs are about the virus and its impact, whether or not we consciously believe that the virus and all of the things going on in the world are a threat, are a mortal threat, are deadly, whether we consciously sort of minimize those things or we allow for those things, TMT says that this is always going on in our unconscious in some ways. So to briefly tie it back to existential humanistic frameworks, I would say that what we do in awareness is impacted by what is out of awareness in the process of coming into awareness. Again, this is just a reminder that existential humanistic psychology and psychotherapy does not have a concept of the unconscious per se, but it does allow for what is out of awareness and what is in awareness. So I always want to sort of bring these two into a synthetic kind of partnership. The terror potential is moderated by our cultural worldviews, self-esteem, and interpersonal relationships. In other words, those things help mitigate the terror that ultimately is aroused by reminders of death awareness when they come into our purview. Our cultural worldviews impact our feelings and beliefs about our literal and symbolic immortality. We have a way of structuring and having a container for our longing to transcend and to comfort ourselves in the face of the reality of death and the limitations on the, in terms of our existence in this world. So facing our mortality is something that our cultural worldviews into which we are born and which evolve over the course of our lives, it can be a container for some sense of comfort in doing something lasting in some way. Worldviews can be validated by the reminders of death that kind of come up, but also they can be undermined by the threats to our self-esteem and security, by imminent thoughts of death or the reality of death making itself felt all around us. So, I'll leave it to you to speculate about the extent to which this is happening in the world in unprecedented ways. In my view, I think I see this as a framework that accounts for it really, really well. So the theory really kind of breaks this down into unconscious defenses, and you can think about these as an expansion of what Freud talks about with defense mechanisms and some of the ego psychologists and those who followed Freud in expanding about defense mechanisms. In particular, though, these are defenses that are sort of rallied in the face of imminent reminders of death. Proximal defenses, the word proximal meaning close, or near. This is related, this basically says that what we do, it's all about what we do that is directly focused on the problem of death. It's, death being imminent. It's activated by conscious death-related thoughts. So when we are there actively thinking about them and we are aware of, or having these death-related thoughts in our awareness, that's when proximal defenses are activated. So examples of this, and you can see that they can be both helpful and unhelpful. Addictive behaviors, we try to do these kinds of things to distract ourselves from the stark reality of these things. Patterns of substance abuse, prolonged device and internet use, compulsive eating, snacking, or the cognitive minimization of threats. I also think that healthy proximal defenses can kind of be put into play. A sudden desire to exercise, to become fit. I really, in my life, I like to take walks in the natural world. I seek out places of beauty. There was an old comic cartoon in the 1990s called Bloom County, and it featured a cartoon penguin named Opus. And when Opus would watch TV and become overwhelmed by all of the threats of nuclear war and the imminent destruction of the world, he would go and sit in a patch of dandelions, and he called it taking a dandelion break. This would be, something I can personally relate to, and would be an example, I think, of a proximal defense that would be sort of a positive sort of thing. Distal, literally meaning more distant, more peripheral. These sort of defenses are less directly focused on death, but they are all about immortality, permanence, and leaving our legacy. They ultimately serve as an endeavor to suppress death-related thoughts, and they work to increase our commitment to our worldview, to preserve and enhance our self-esteem, to reduce death anxiety when they can keep death-related thoughts at a subliminal level. So differences in our perceptions or our beliefs about threats posed by the virus, the political climate of the world, global climate change, choosing occupations that feel close to ourselves, more authentic, and that established that we've contributed to the world in meaningful ways, are all examples of the implementation of distal defenses. And even now, at this late stage of the pandemic, as the virus fears and anxiety we're experiencing give way to concerns about climate change, global violence, racial and ethnic conflicts and violence, the return of global nuclear fears in connection with the war between Russia and Ukraine, humanity's been confronted with unprecedented and unrelenting reminders of death for the past 3 years now. I mean, and just really allow that to sink in. Again, in my lifetime, I've simply not experienced something like that to that degree. This all relates really well to Ernest Becker's theory about denial of death. Maladaptive death denial behaviors appear in the face of being overwhelmed by all of this. When we are not able to effectively manage our terror by building a meaningful and purposeful life, and I would suggest here that many of us are increasingly unable to do this effectively in the face of this unrelenting assault. Then we see an increase in mental health challenges that manifest in a variety of ways along biological, psychological, social, and even spiritual dimensions. And I believe that we are seeing that and experiencing that. And frighteningly, mental health professionals are as vulnerable, if not more, to these things than along with everybody else. Mental health professionals, though, can serve a key role in partnering with individuals, families, and groups to reconnect with meaning, purpose, and constructive immortality. The legacy sort of leaving that will give us some comfort and security, a sense of security in the face of all of this insecurity. So I think that these sort of lead to the opportunities I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But we do also need to confront, speaking of worldviews and cultural kinds of constructions, in a global context, I think it's meaningful to consider whether death anxiety and death denial mean the same things in non-Western contexts as they do to us here in the West. I think it becomes an important question now. I mean, I see it as really an explanatory theoretical framework for what we see going on. And particularly here in the US, I think it has a lot of explanatory power. But in Eastern contexts, for instance, where the concept of self is different and the concept of the ego is different, and there's an affirmation that death is understood differently, does it really mean the same things? I think there's an opportunity for more research to kind of understand if this is applicable in such a way, and what a collectivist kind of ethic as opposed to an individualist ethic has to do with all of this. This relates to this idea that I've heard so many times during the pandemic. We are all in the same boat. And I don't know about anyone else here, but that struck me as a little bothersome every time I heard it, because are we really? We're in the same storm, but I would say that we're in vastly different kinds of boats, and that privilege really makes a difference. So the way, in which we are bringing our proximal and distal defenses in terror management theory terminology to bear, some of us have more resources for that than others. And these things really need to be carefully considered and addressed. And if we're going to do this, we cannot continue to cater to a privileged majority. This idea that only a few get to weather the storm in secure boats, or whatever. So we have to really, this is an invitation more than ever to confront the socioeconomic disparities in this country and in the world, racial disparities in access to healthcare, and the impact on the planet of everything that we're doing. And I think it's beyond the scope of this presentation to consider the ecological origins of the virus and its impact on all of us, and how what we have been doing with and to the planet has contributed to the viral pandemic and all of that. But it's something I think that really needs to be kind of considered holistically. And lastly, I'd like to mention here that my dear colleague and friend, Theopia Jackson, who is the past president of the Association of Black Psychologists from 2019 to 2021, she has talked about this need to confront the myth of African inferiority and of white supremacy as it arises pervasively in all areas of life, not the least of which is at these disparities in access to healthcare. This is the kind of thing that I love seeing, because Theopia is also a longtime member of the board of Division 32, the Society for Humanistic Psychology. And she really is trying to mend the broken and fractured relationship between the APA and the Association of Black Psychologists in an authentic way, acknowledging that there is a long, long, long way to go with all of that. But this is, I love to see this existential humanistic kind of embrace as a way of addressing these cultural and economic racial disparities with all of this. And I think that while terror management theory and some of these existential views can really help us understand what is happening, it's going to be the existential humanistic psychology's embrace of global social justice and multicultural psychology that gives us the way of building and repairing the infrastructure that's necessary for global healing in this regard. All right, so that leads sort of naturally, hopefully, to this discussion of invitations and opportunities for creativity and resourcefulness. Rollo May, of course, in his book, The Courage to Create, I mentioned earlier, talks about instead of succumbing to despair, we can utilize this as a source of creative endeavors to try to come together with all of this and to discover who we are in the face of all of these things and to work together more constructively. I humorously sort of talk about this as Star Trek versus Terminator futures of humankind. I'm revealing my geeky sci-fi interests and pop culture kinds of interests here, but I see the Star Trek future as the hopeful one, where we have an embrace of diversity, an embrace of human gifts and strengths to learn to live in harmony with the planet, and in Star Trek's case, of course, with all of the alien races of the universe, ultimately. and to collaborate on solutions and all of those things. Or all of these fears and are succumbing to the death fears and the death anxieties. This is sort of embodied in the Terminator movies, where artificial intelligence ultimately wipes out or endeavors to wipe out humanity in this bleak, dystopian, post-apocalyptic kind of future. So in considering in terms of our vision of all of this, I prefer the sort of Star Trek vision, if you will. But if nothing else, there's certainly an invitation to engage in deeper therapy work. I think existential humanistic approaches have had from their outset what we need to have in psychotherapy relationships. I think we need to embrace meaningful telehealth work and to try to continue to creatively create what Martin Buber, the philosopher, calls that sacred I-thou relationship across cyberspace. And how do we do that when we can't even make genuine eye contact across the computer screen? Nevertheless, I think, it's sort of it could be a very creative and even fun sort of opportunity to kind of meet that challenge. Opportunities for movement toward greater advocacy as mental health professionals. I think that the time is long past for staying in the therapy office 9 to 5. We need to really continue to make what we do as therapists more relevant by advocating for transformative social change in the world. And this is a way of utilizing those collective distal defenses that terror management theory talks about in very constructive ways. And then returning to a community mental health emphasis, it tried to get off the ground in the 60s and 70s. And I think we're seeing some signs of new growth with it again. But action research and action in our communities also engaged in efforts toward prevention and addressing our own self-care and healing, because we won't be able to ethically and professionally be effective until we can address these wounds that we're experiencing in ourselves with all of this. So I think that we are getting close to being out of time, so I will end the presentation there and maybe return to an audience view here for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spaeth. I will go ahead and open it up if anyone would like to unmute themselves, or if you prefer to write them in the chat box, I can go ahead and read your question out loud.
Yeah, I see Megan's raising your hand, looks like.
Yes, I just found this extremely interesting, and I'm actually a music therapist as well. So I've worked in inpatient psych wards with severely mentally ill, but also in intercultural community centers as an outpatient therapist. And I find that I think this kind of work would be really helpful now, because I'm seeing these kind of issues come forth with people really almost panicking because they're questioning their mortality, and they're asking these kinds of questions now, whereas before it was more medication management and management of symptoms and things like that. But now they're asking deeper questions of what's going on. And as a music therapist, I'm hoping to, like, in my degree, I'm an international psychology student, so I'm hoping to do this on a worldwide level, traveling in, like, because music is such a cultural phenomenon that is used for healing in so many places. So it's so helpful in so many things. And I just think that these are the things we need to be working on, and this was so interesting to me. So thank you so much for having this talk, because this is I find it really fantastic. You just hit all the right points of what I'm seeing in my practice. Thank you.
And that's so validating to hear, because I'm seeing it as well. And Rollo May talks about the importance of reconnecting with beauty with a capital B, you know, truth and beauty, all of the things the philosophers used to talk about. And
Yes.
we need to make those things directly accessible to everybody. And I can't think of a better way than things like music, art, and poetry, which there are levels of richness that talk can never, ever get to.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're a fellow Wisconsinite. I grew up in Shawano. So yeah, I know exactly where you are.
Yeah, very good.
So thank you.
All right. I think we have,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. So we have two minutes left. So I'll quickly ask this question in the chat box from Natalie. It says,
Yeah.
for minority groups whose community might present a hostile environment, do you have an opinion on whether isolation from that community would actually be more beneficial for the individuals? For example, allowing LGBTQ+ students to opt into virtual schooling when their rural community ostracizes them.
Well, I hope it won't appear overly simplistic if I sort of go back to that breathing and heartbeat analogy I made early in the presentation. Expansion and contraction, moving in, moving out, that Gestalt idea of craving contact and then backing away from it when it becomes too intense. I think that this moving in and moving out is something we do very naturally and as human beings. And we need to honor our longings in that regard. And if something is not serving in terms of coming together in community, isolating for a time might make sense. And yet I also believe that there might be a time for that isolation to end as well, and sort of following the natural rhythms of the planet itself. Maybe it sounds too woo-woo, but I don't think so.
Thank you all so much. We have actually perfectly run into our time now. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Spade, for your talk. If anybody has any additional questions, I can go ahead and relay them to Dr. Spade via the Engage email. So that is engage@tcsedsystem.edu. And I'd just like to let everyone know that we do have one more talk happening today as well. And you will receive the recording of this talk as well as an invitation to our final group talk today. So thank you all so much. We're wishing you a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Spade.